A very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us this afternoon for this workshop on publishing in academic journals. We have a lot of people that registered, so we'll give it a few seconds for everybody to come in from the waiting room. Fabulous. So already 140 people. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us for today's session, part of the European Research and Innovation Days in ASEAN 2021. And today we are having the first in a series of 7 workshops on career development training for researchers in Southeast Asia, in Europe, anywhere in the world. My name is Susanne Ransobasu. I am part of the Euraxis worldwide team here in Southeast Asia. And we are part of a global network that is focused on connecting researchers with each other. We want to connect the research community here in Southeast Asia with their counterparts in Europe and, of course, in other parts of the world. We're holding the European Research and Innovation Days once per year. This is really our flagship event, and it is your platform where we inform you about the opportunities that Europe has on offer to collaborate, to spend some part of your research career for your own career development, and to really join forces to tackle some of the big issues that we are faced with nowadays, such as climate change and global health. This is the topic of this year's European Research Days. Of course, what is important for researchers to be mobile internationally is to have the right research skills. And this is why in the next 8 days or so, we will be hosting 7 career development workshops. And the first one today is focusing on a very important issue, which is, of course, publishing your research. Now, publishing is an integral element of any researcher's career. I'm sure your university or your research institute is committing you to publishing your research output. It's very important for your own career development. But publishing your research is also a very essential element when it comes to international collaboration. If you want to reach out to other researchers that are not in your vicinity, you need to make your research accessible to them. This is why we have invited a very fabulous speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Victoria BABBIT. She is the Director of Research and Development and Outreach at Taylor & Francis, the publishing house which she joined in 2008. And throughout the past decade or so, she has supported societies, editors and authors as they navigate, which is a rapidly changing publishing landscape. Her work involves engaging with global researcher communities to build knowledge and capacity related to publishing and editorial activities. And Victoria is here today to give us this 1-hour workshop for you to get started on how to get your research published. Now, Victoria, the floor is yours.
Great. And you can see the slides, correct?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Great. Wonderful. Well, many thanks for that introduction, and welcome to all of you who have joined the webinar today. I'd like to thank Suzanne, Jenny, and the organizing committee of the European Research and Innovation Days in ASEAN for inviting me to be a part of this excellent program. I mean, it's just been, looking at the website, what a program, really ambitious and fantastic. So good job. So the session today, we will be exploring different elements of the publishing process with a particular focus on open access publishing. Now, if you have any questions, I believe there's a chat box where you can write the questions in, and we will take time at the end of the session to address as many of the questions as we can. I also will include my email address on the last slide so that if you have any questions afterwards, you're welcome to contact me. And keep in mind, we will be sharing the slides. Is that possible, Suzanne, to share the slides with everyone?
Absolutely. We will share the slides afterwards.
Great. Wonderful. So let's get started. I thought to begin with, it might be useful to take a look at the publishing landscape today. So there are approximately 10,000 publishers in the world today, and 5,000 of those are indexed in Scopus. And those publishers are publishing, are publishing around 33,000 active English language peer-reviewed journals, with a further 9,400 plus non-English language peer-reviewed journals. And this number has traditionally grown by about 3.5% year on year. And these journals are publishing over 3 million articles a year. And that number has traditionally grown by about 3% year on year. However, in recent years, we have seen these growth rates accelerating. So we saw about a growth rate of about 5% of new journals and about 4% of additional articles year on year. Although in the last couple of years, we've seen those numbers, the numbers of new journals decline slightly. And this is in part due to an increase in research and development spend on the parts of governments. And that investment is going towards supporting anywhere between 7 and 9 million researchers globally. Now, an interesting statistic that was a part of this report, which was put together by the STM organization, which is a publishing body organization that assesses the publishing landscape. One of the interesting statistics that they included is that only 20% of these 7 to 9 million researchers are repeat authors. So the majority of people publish only one time in their career. Irrespective, as you can see, this is a really busy landscape. So it's important for you to think through your research and publishing strategies at the start if you'd like to make an impact on this landscape. Now, one of the key ways of making an impact is publishing in the right journal or platform. In fact, choosing a journal that is not a good fit for your work can slow down the publishing process significantly. So it's important to take this part of the process seriously and be thoughtful about your journal choice. Now, before you begin investigating possible journal options for your work, it's essential to spend some time understanding your current project and the audience that you're hoping to reach. Throughout your career, you're likely to be involved in many different types of research, which will lead you to produce a variety of content. Typically, people focus on the research article, but you may publish review articles, whether that's a literature review or a theory review or a systematic review. You may publish position pieces or case studies. You might be interested in writing a piece for a local or national newspaper. You might be interested in publishing book reviews. All of this is perfectly fine. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you also may choose to engage in public scholarship, as I just mentioned, so writing for the general public, or you might be interested in working with policymakers. So take time to determine your objectives at the start. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field. So you want to make sure that you're contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. There are many different elements to take into consideration when choosing a journal, and I've listed a few of them here. So age, a well-established journal with a good reputation is a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research in the field, or they may be using a really interesting publishing model. You just want to make sure to do your research on the journal before you submit. It can also be helpful to look at the history of the journal. Has it published key researchers in the field or key pieces of research? Does it publish on time? Affiliation may be important. So is it a journal of an important society or a key institution in your field? Is it published by a trusted publishing house? And scope is key. And by this, I mean, is it an interdisciplinary journal, or is it a niche journal focusing on a really small subject area? Or does it publish across broad subject matter? Is it a mega journal? All of this will be outlined in the aims and scope statement on the journal website. And then you might be interested in knowing who reads a journal typically. Is it directed towards practitioners? Is it a local journal, focusing on a kind of regional audience, or is it interested in a global audience? Now, impact is important for many different people, and it can be measured in a number of ways. So we can talk about the impact factor, which a lot of people focus on, but it might be that it's just a journal that's very important in your particular academic community. It might be a great source for teaching, etc. The most important thing is that you understand what is valued in your institution and your field in terms of impact, and let that guide you when you're making these types of choices. Now, editorial boards will give an indication of what type of research journals are interested in receiving. So editorial boards are built to reflect the ambitions of a journal. For instance, if the journal is just kind of a general journal that's kind of crossing broad subject matter, but they see this kind of emergent area of research in the field, they're probably going to try and find someone that is a specialist in that area to join the editorial board, so that they can act as an ambassador to researchers in that particular research area. And they can also help to facilitate the peer review process, because they'll know who all the specialists are in that particular area. Likewise with geography, if it is a journal that is interested in receiving more submissions from Malaysia, they'll probably try and find a specialist in that area that's based in Malaysia, again, who can act as an ambassador for the journal and try and pull in some of the great research that's being produced in that area. Now, publishing model is also becoming increasingly important, and we'll discuss open access in just a moment. And then there's peer review style, which may be very important to you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about peer review a bit later, but just to say information about what type of peer review the journal runs should always be included in the instructions for authors on the journal website. And then lastly, many journals post their rejection rate, and this will give you an indication of the competition level of a journal. However, some of these other characteristics will also. So it's, again, just about looking at the journal and assessing it. Still, it can be challenging to choose a journal even after taking into account all of these characteristics. However, there are great tools out there to help. So at Taylor & Francis, we have what we call a journal suggester, which will match your abstract with potential journals based on their aims and scope statement. So basically what you do is you cut and paste your abstract into that white area there and click on Reveal Suggested Journals. And the system will provide you with a list of journals that you can then investigate further. Our advice is to select a few journals that you feel are a good fit for your current piece of work, and create a list and rank them from your #1 choice onward. And when it's time for you to submit, you can start at the top of your list. And if your #1 choice isn't interested in your manuscript, then you just try the next one, and so on and so forth until your article is accepted. Again, it's about having a really clear strategy at the beginning and acting on that strategy. As said, I'm going to focus a bit on open access today, as it really is becoming an incredibly important aspect of the academic life and the preferred publishing model for many funders. But I thought we'd start at the beginning for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with open access. So there are two essential elements to open access. The first one is about making content freely available to anywhere in the world. And the second one is about making content reusable by a third party after publication. And I'll briefly discuss both of these elements. So when you hear about open access, you're going to hear a lot of different names thrown out there. So you'll hear green open access, you might hear diamond open access, you might hear bronze open access. Today, we're going to focus on gold open access. And gold open access essentially entails making the PDF or the version of record freely available online. And there are two ways in which an author can publish open access with Taylor & Francis and with most publishers, either in a fully open access journal or in what we call a hybrid journal. So fully open access journals publish all of their content open access. These journals aren't funded by subscriptions. So instead, most charge what's called an APC, or an article publishing charge. However, many journals are funded by societies or institutions. And in that case, either the author doesn't have to pay, or they may pay a reduced fee. And there is also a lot of waiver programs out there too for authors that don't have the funds to pay for APCs. And then we have hybrid open access. And this is when an author chooses to publish open access in a journal that is subscription funded, and much of the content is not freely accessible unless you or your institution has a subscription. So these journals charge an APC to cover the publication costs for the open access article. However, many institutions and consortia have agreements with publishers to cover APC costs for hybrid journals. So before you think about submitting to an open access journal, it's really about investigating what your options are in terms of, for fully open access journals, if there are waivers or what types of APCs might be in place, or if it is a hybrid journal, whether or not your institution might have an arrangement with the publisher. Now, the second element of open access is how your work can be used after publication by others. So if you publish your work open access, you'll be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals don't give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it is important that you investigate prior to submission in case you have any concerns. So here are the licenses. We have CC BY, and this license allows you to others to use your work in any way they choose, as long as they clearly attribute the authorship and the original publication. And then next we have CC BY NC. And here an author can use your work in any manner, but they cannot profit from it. For instance, they can't include your article in a book that they will subsequently charge money for. And then next we have CC BY ND. And here the author cannot change your work in any way. They must use it in the original form. For instance, this would mean that they couldn't translate your work and publish a translation. And then lastly, I've included CC BY SA. And this means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license. And it's important to be aware of this license as well when you're using other people's work. So what are the benefits of publishing in an open access journal or an open access platform? Well, the main benefits are greater visibility, and with that, potentially greater impact, both within the research community and the broader public. And the access, visibility, and impact can spur innovation and greater collaboration. So at Taylor & Francis, we have seen that open access articles typically receive substantially more citations. So we've seen about a 32% increase and greater readership with over 6 times as many downloads of those articles. However, unfortunately, with the rise of open access, we have seen an emergence of what are often called predatory publishers or predatory journals. And I can imagine that many of you on this call have been contacted by these publishers who show enthusiastic interest in your work and ask you to submit your article to the journal. They usually tend to send many emails day after day, trying to solicit new articles for the journals. The websites and journal names might be similar to well-respected journals, but will feature information that is incorrect or slightly misleading. So here are some of the key characteristics of predatory journals. First of all, they'll often have hidden or unclear author fees. Keep in mind, any type of fees that a journal charges, APCs or otherwise, should be clearly outlined on the journal webpage, usually under the instructions for authors. They tend to lack quality peer review of articles by experts in the field, and they tend to guarantee acceptance and or promise really fast publication times. So they talk about publication within a week, or peer review that takes 48 hours. If you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally and or internationally, it is important to avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all the research published in them. Now, luckily, there are some great resources out there to help you make sound decisions about where you would like to publish. For instance, a key resource is Think, Check, Submit. This is a cross-industry initiative which aims to help researchers make informed choices and to choose trusted journals to publish their research in. Think, Check, Submit helps you identify high-quality journals through the toolkit that they've created. So they created a toolkit that's comprised of a number of questions that you can use to interrogate a journal. And this can, protect you against fraud and publishing malpractice. Now, the second resource I wanted to highlight is the DOAJ, which is the database for open access journals. The journals in this database have been screened to ensure that they are legitimate. However, like many databases, there is an assessment period for new journals. So a new journal that is legitimate may not be listed in the database immediately. And in those cases, you need to make sure that the journal in question is published by a respected publisher. And here's where the last organization on the slide, OASPA, comes in handy. So OASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open access. Members need to meet certain standards to be included in OASPA. So if the open access journal you're considering publishing in isn't included in the DOAJ and the publisher isn't a member of OASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. And one resource, or actually two resources that aren't listed on this slide. The first one is your own network. Obviously, it's really good to talk to people within your field to find out what they know about the different journals you're considering. But also, don't forget your librarian community. They have a really good sense of what the legitimate publishers, who the legitimate publishers are out there, and what journals are legitimate as well. Right, so today we're not going to be doing a writing workshop. Obviously, we only have an hour, and I'm sure this is a very interdisciplinary group. But I do have some simple guidance for you to consider while preparing your manuscript. And the first piece of advice I have for you is to think like an editor. Make it easy for them to read and to enjoy your work. Depending on the size of a journal, editors can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 manuscripts a year. So you want to make sure yours stands out. And here are some basic tips to help you make your argument easy to read and understand. Write first and edit later, if at all possible, because this helps you to create a through line in your paper, that line that's going to hold all the different parts of your argument and your evidence together. And remember, simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems or complex theories. So think about your sentence structure and your use of the passive voice. So in terms of sentence structure, when I was teaching, I used to encourage my students to limit their sentences to 2.5 lines on a page, because by the time you get to the third line, as a reader, you're starting to forget what the author was writing in that first line. So again, you want to keep them at a decent length and think about changing up the lengths of your sentence just so that you get a nice flow in your paper. And in terms of the passive voice, obviously in method sections, we tend to use the passive voice. You wouldn't write, I did this. Instead, it's usually the research was conducted. And that's perfectly fine. But you want to mix it up a bit. So if you're using a little bit of the passive voice, you want to make sure to have active voice around there too. Again, the goal is to make it as easy as possible for your reader to understand your arguments and the evidence. And another tip there is think about reading your work out loud a bit, just to see how it flows. Now, the most important strategy to achieving an easy to read and understand argument is to create a clear and easy to follow structure to your paper. And irrespective of discipline, most papers follow this model, the IMRAD model. So it's especially important that you create a strong introduction. So 2 to 3 pages that establishes the research question or problem you're exploring, provides a clear thesis or argument, which is easy to see and understand. So make sure your argument stands out. You don't want to bury it in the second page in the third paragraph. It should be really prominent. You should also provide an outline of the structure of your paper. I've written roadmap here, letting readers know what they can expect, which would be the methods or theory section, your results or findings, a discussion, and finally a conclusion. And lastly, keep in mind, your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to the exciting story of your research. So be brave and be bold and really relay that passion that you've had for the research over the 2 to 3 years that you've been conducting it. Take that and really try and infuse that into the article that you're writing. Now, once you publish, you of course would like people to be able to find and read your work. And this begins with the basics, the first elements of your article that potential readers will see, which is the title and the abstract. Now, title styles and format can vary somewhat depending on subject area and your own individual writing style. However, there are some tricks to keep in mind when composing your title. First of all, you want to write the title after you've written the paper, though it's not a bad idea to jot down ideas while you're writing if you struggle coming up with title ideas. And secondly, try to keep your title short and to the point. So we usually recommend 16 words or fewer. You also want to avoid any jargon or abbreviations that you are using in your work. Again, the title is very short, so it should be very simple language that you're using in that title because you don't have time to explain the jargon or the abbreviation. For those of you using qualitative methods, sometimes there's a temptation to have a quote in your title, which is perfectly fine. But if you do have a quote in your title, then you do want to have kind of a subtitle there that is explaining what the paper is going to be about as well. So here's just a nice quote from one of our editors about abstracts. And I actually really appreciate this frank quote. Abstract should tell the reader what the article is about. It's as simple as that. I always think of them as like mini film trailers for articles. They should give a sense of what the story is about without providing all the detail. And here's some basic tips for creating a strong abstract. First of all, like the title, it's difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish writing the paper because the abstract is an overview of the content. You want to make sure that you know what the parameters for the particular journal are, the journal that you're submitting to are. So many journals have word counts for their abstracts. Most abstracts are usually 250 words to 300 words, and some have guidance on the format and structure. So they want a structured abstract. They want it to look a certain way. So do take a look at the instructions for authors to find out what those requirements are. And then you want to think about who your potential audience is and write it for them, because you might use slightly different language if you're writing for practitioners as opposed to people that are deeply embedded in your research area. And once you've written your abstract, go through and remove any unnecessary words. You really want to focus on that essential information. And if you have ended up revising your paper after you've written the abstract, make sure to go back and review the abstract and revise it as necessary as well, because you might have made some significant changes to your paper during the revisions process, and it might not match that abstract any longer. And lastly, read it out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read and understand, it's unlikely people will click through to the actual article because they'll feel that the article is probably poorly written as well. Now, in terms of manuscript preparation, there are some strategies for increasing the visibility of your work linked to search engine optimization, or SEO. So on the screen are 6 tips for authors to follow, and it all begins with identifying keywords for your research. This is a crucial first step. Authors need to identify the relevant keywords for the article. It's helpful to think about the search terms that someone would use to find your article. And I recommend that you test out your keywords in Google Scholar to see what sort of results you get. If the results aren't what you were expecting, try a different word. And there's a great tool, Google Trends, that can help you identify how many times keywords and phrases are searched for. So there's some tools out there that you can use to help you identify good keywords for your research. Now, in terms of the article title, the title needs to contain a key phrase related to your topic. Google Scholar considers the length of title, so put your keywords within the first 65 characters of the title. And with the abstract, similar to the title, it's important to also include keywords and phrases in the abstract. And given there are more characters available here, it's also worth bringing in synonyms too, especially if your work is interdisciplinary. And then the headings in your article. Search engines will use headings within an article to index the structure and the content of the paper. Include your article keywords wherever you possibly can. And then for inbound links, once an article is published, the more places an author promotes it, the better. Links on web pages or blogs or social media, etc., are all indexed by search engines and help to boost an article's position in search rankings. And then lastly, citations. Search engines add a lot of weight to article citations. Adding a citation and a link to previously published articles can boost the rankings for those papers and the new paper being published. Okay, before we discuss the process further, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the ethical issues that we see on a regular basis. Issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or it's just possible that we're getting better at identifying some of these breaches. So here are some of the issues that we see on a regular basis. And I need to note that this is a partial list. We could easily have a full session on publishing ethics today. But what I thought I would do is just focus on 3 of the most common issues that we see across disciplines. And that's authorship disputes, duplicate submission and publication, and then plagiarism and text recycling. So authorship issues are quite common, and they tend to slow down the peer review and production process. If there's a dispute between authors, we tend to just stop the process and ask the authors to resolve it, because we as publishers and our editors don't know what happened during the writing process, so we can't really make a comment on that. Often the issues have to do with disagreements over who's included on the authorship line, the sequence of names, who is responsible for different parts of the process, or what journal they intend to submit to. So to avoid any problems, it's extremely important that you have a written agreement between all of the authors regarding responsibilities, the sequence of names on the authorship line, and what journal you're submitting to. And you should have that at the beginning of the process so you don't run into any problems. Now, apart from the standard authorship disputes, here are 3 distinct issues that we see. The first one is called ghost authorship, and this is when a significant contribution to a manuscript has been made without acknowledgement of that contribution. So this is an issue because we can't know if there was a conflict of interest if not all of the authors are listed on the authorship line. Now, the next issue that we see is guest authorship, and this is when authorship is granted to someone who doesn't meet the ethical standards of authorship. And they're usually included on the authorship line because of their seniority or their reputation or their supposed influence in the field. Now, this has been common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they will be held responsible for it in the future. And then lastly, we have authorship for sale. There have been a number of cases where individuals or predatory publishers or paper mills offer to add an author's name after a paper has been accepted, but they charge for this. And these actors obviously are preying on the desperation of scholars who are under pressure to publish more and more articles to progress in their careers. But who qualifies as an author? On this slide, I've included our definition of an author, and you'll note that the word "and" is linking these descriptions, not the word "or." But the general takeaway is any listed author is representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study as published. So that means rationale, methodology, analysis, and interpretation. Duplicate submission is a rule that many early career researchers are a bit surprised by. At least I have to confess I was when I first learned about it. Why might it be a problem to submit to more than one journal at a time? When you submit your paper to a journal for peer review, you are committing to publish your paper in that journal if they accept it. And they in turn will use their time and their resources to review your paper and help you improve it. And keep in mind, you can only publish a paper once. There can only be one version of record out there. Now, this tends to be fairly easy to detect because often the papers are sent to the same reviewers who then alert the editor and publishers that they're looking at the same paper for two different journals. And this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement on the roles and responsibilities between authors. Hence, two of the co-authors accidentally submit the same paper to two different journals. But editors are becoming less forgiving and oftentimes withdraw the paper in question from peer review when this occurs. I mean, obviously we go back to the author and ask for an explanation, but we are noticing that many authors are doing this intentionally to try and move through peer review as quick as possible. So the tolerance for this is declining, I must say. Now, sometimes it is okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about the previous presentation or publication or posting. Transparency is key in this process. For instance, if you've published an article in another language but would like to publish it in English, you just need to contact the editor of the journal you'd like to publish with and ask them if they'd be interested in publishing a translation. They may be happy to do so, or they may say, we don't publish translations, but this journal over there does, whatever the case is. You also need to remember, if you're interested in publishing a translation, you need to talk to the original publisher to make sure it's okay that you publish a translation. Similarly, with data presented at conferences, it's not unusual to publish an article that's based on content presented at a conference. It's part of the process, actually. You just want to make sure to clearly state that the data or an earlier version of the paper was presented at a conference. And then preprint servers. Preprint servers no longer are an issue for most journals. Again, you need to cite that original posting in your paper. Let the editor know that a version of your paper can be found in a preprint server or an archive or repository, and provide a link to it. And then remember, once the paper is published, and there is a version of record, that you go back to the preprint server and add the link to the version of record so people can see that final version. And then lastly, originality issues. These are also becoming much easier to detect. Most journals use software to measure instances of overlap with previously published work. And most of you on this call will know that if you use someone else's ideas or processes or words, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide a full reference to the work. And this is true of all content, including websites, blogs, and your own previously published work. However, we are seeing a rise of what's called text recycling, or sometimes you'll hear the term salami slicing. And this is when you use the same ideas, data, and or words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or field. Anything you publish should be original content and pushing the research field forward in some way. Now, once you're ready to submit, there are a few steps that you should take. First of all, it's a really good idea that you review what has already been published in your journal of choice. You may find work that's relevant to your own. And if you do find work that's engaging in the same themes or subject matter that you are, do reference that previously published work. Remember, you're joining a conversation. So that's a conversation that's ongoing in that journal. Now, you only want to reference, obviously, work that is relevant to your own, that has been published in that journal. And then you want to make sure also that your work matches the aims and scope statement of the journal. So I've got an example of an aims and scope statement on the slide here. These statements describe the journal's mission and the type of research they're interested in publishing. editors spent a good deal of time crafting these statements. They tend to be fairly short. And so they want to create a statement that, that will make the journal understandable to readers, to librarians, and authors, so that they all understand exactly what the journal is about. And keep in mind, one of the main reasons manuscripts are rejected is because the research did not fall within the scope of the journal. So you'll find the aims and scope statement on the journal website. Sometimes it's on the landing page, or there will be a link, a fairly prominent link on the landing page that you can click on. The other piece of advice I have is to make sure to read and follow the instructions for authors. And I've got an example of one there. These are the rule books for the journals. They provide guidance on how to format your paper, on word counts, and as I mentioned earlier, they'll provide information on any relevant charges, whether that's APCs or maybe page charges or maybe submission fees. And lastly, just a quick word about language. Many authors ask me, should I send my paper to language editing service before I submit? And I've asked the editors I've worked with over the years this question. And I found that most editors are happy to look at a paper as long as they can understand the argument and the methods. The language does not have to be perfect. However, do try and have a native English speaker or someone who has a good deal of knowledge and experience with the language and publishing read your paper for fluency. Now, in the end, if you do feel that you need language editing before you submit, many publishers like Taylor and Francis do have editing services. You just need to check their websites. So for ours, you'll find our editing services on our author resources site. So here are some basic tips to keep in mind while submitting. First of all, in most cases, you'll be submitting to an online system. So you want to make sure that you have all of the files on hand you need to submit as you start that process. And if you're using images or data that's not yours, make sure that you've obtained permission ahead of time. That's your responsibility. And to avoid any problems or mistakes, make sure that you have that agreed upon plan with your co-authors, if you have co-authors, on who's responsible for what and which journals you're submitting to. Also, be certain that you have the correct information of all of your co-authors. So that includes their preferred spelling of their last name, their affiliation, current affiliation, and contact information. And lastly, I know this sounds a bit silly, but make sure the version you submit is the final version and not an earlier draft. It has happened in the past that authors submit a version of their paper and they wait for peer review, and then they get the rejection notice from the journal and they open up the file and realize they've submitted an earlier version of their paper. So take that extra 5 to 10 minutes to review your files before you upload them onto the system to make sure that they are the relevant files. Great, so now we're going to take a look at what peer review looks like in practice. And there are 3 different types of peer review you're likely to come across. The first is called single blind or single anonymous peer review. And this is when the peer reviewer knows the identity of the author, but the author doesn't know the identity of the peer reviewer. And this tends to be the most common type of peer review that you'll find in science, technology, and medicine disciplines. Now, the second type of peer review, double blind peer review or double anonymous peer review, is when all identities are hidden. And this is the most common type of peer review within arts and humanities and the social sciences. And then lastly, we have open peer review. And this is where all identities are known. So the peer reviewer knows who the author is, the author knows who the peer reviewer is. However, there are many, many different varieties of open peer review. So you can have it as simple as that, where everyone knows each other's identity, or it could be as open as our F1000 research platform, where the entire process is visible to the public. So the author's preprint is posted on the website after certain checks, and then it goes through peer review, and everyone can see the peer reviewer's comments. They can see the different revisions of the paper, and they can see the author's comments. So it's completely open. So if the journal that you're submitting to does practice open peer review, it's really important that you do look at the instructions for authors to make sure you understand what's involved in that process. And here's an overview of how peer review works in most cases. First of all, your manuscript is submitted to the journal, and it's going to go through a check to see if everything is in order. So if it's not formatted correctly, or if it's missing files or other components, it will be returned to you with instructions on what to do. Then once the files are in order, the submission is then sent to the editor for a quick review. The editor will decide if the paper should be sent out to peer review. Usually they're going to read the introduction and then kind of skim through the rest of the paper. So that's why I say the introduction is really important, that you really clearly present your paper in that introduction, because that will definitely be read by the editor. Now, at this stage, the paper can be rejected if it's out of scope of the journal, if it's not complete, if it's unreadable, or if it's not understandable. And this is called a desk reject. And usually you get this decision relatively quickly, within a couple of weeks. Now, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out for peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in that particular field. They will read the work and provide a report for the editor with a recommendation for a decision. So the most common recommendations are revise and resubmit with major revisions or with minor revisions. This means they're interested in your work, but they just have some suggestions on how you can make it even better. So you should celebrate if you receive this decision. Now, the difference between revise and resubmit with major revisions and minor revisions is revise and resubmit with major revisions means that they like something about your paper. It could be the data you're using, it could be your argument, your case study or whatever, but there's still a lot of work that you need to do. It's not guaranteed that the paper will be accepted, but they want you to continue working on it. Whereas revise and resubmit with minor revisions means that there's only a few small things that you need to change. You might need to include some references, you might need to do some work on your visuals, but if you address all of the recommendations, the paper is likely to be accepted. Now, your paper can also be rejected at this point, obviously. And then I've included accept, but I put a star there. It is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions, but it's highly unlikely. And I usually tell this story of Eugene Fama, who is an economist, and he won the Nobel Prize for economics a few years ago. And I'm based in Stockholm, so I'm able to go to some of those lectures. And I decided to go to the lectures that year in economics. And Fama was presenting his papers that were based on the research that led him to win the Nobel Prize. He must have been in his mid-70s. And he's presenting these papers. And to be honest with you, I wasn't following because the mathematics were quite advanced. But at one point, he steps back and goes, huh, you know, I think that's one of the only papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So here you have a man who's presenting the work that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And he's in his mid-70s. And he has maybe a couple of papers that ever were accepted without revisions. So that's just to say, every piece of writing can be improved upon. Revisions are a part of the process, so you should anticipate that those are the types of decisions that you'll get. Now, once you make the revisions, you resubmit to the editor, who will either accept the paper at that point, or they'll send it back out to the reviewers to see if they're happy with it or if they have further comments. Now, here's the bad news. You can go through that process a couple of times and still be rejected. And I'll tell you how to avoid that in just a moment. So responding to the reviewer's comments is a crucial part of the publishing process. And at times when you receive the review report, it can feel like rejection, especially the revise and resubmit with major revisions. If you're feeling a bit upset, close the computer, go into the kitchen, make yourself a cup of tea, and just forget about it for a couple of days. And then when you're ready to get back to work, carefully read the decision letter from the editor. It may include advice on how to respond to reviewers' comments, especially if the reviewers are suggesting kind of opposing things. And it will definitely provide information about deadlines for returning your revisions. If you have co-authors, set up a meeting to review all of the reviewers' comments and make sure to share all the reports with everyone prior to your meeting. And then irrespective if you have co-authors or not, you want to go through the reviewers' reports carefully and make a list with all of their suggestions for improvement. You may want to group the comments based on category if that is easier for you. So you might want to put all the comments of the literature review in one area or the methods section, whatever works for you. But then you need to go through that list and decide which of the recommendations you would like to make and make those changes in your paper. Now, here's the key to avoiding the fate of going through the revisions process a couple of times and still being rejected. When you send back your revisions to the editor, you must include a note to the editor clearly detailing how you have addressed the peer reviewer's concerns. So, where you have adopted the peer reviewer's recommendations, clearly detail what you've changed and where that change can be located in the paper. So be very specific, page number and line. You can always highlight it as well. Some journals do welcome the use of track changes to help editors and peer reviewers see what you've done, but you still do need that cover letter as well, explaining everything. Now, you will not agree with all the peer reviewers' recommendations. That's absolutely normal. In that case, you need to clearly and respectfully explain why you chose not to amend your paper. Again, be very specific. So for instance, if a peer reviewer thought you should cite another paper, but you feel that it's out of scope of your project, explain why that is so both the peer reviewer and the editor understand your logic. Now, once you've detailed how you've addressed each of the peer reviewers' comments, review your response to the editor and make sure that you've included all of the recommendations and actions that you've taken and that you've done so in a clear manner, and that the letter is professional and devoid of any frustration. This can be a really challenging process, so it's understandable that you may become a bit frustrated during it. It's just important that that frustration doesn't influence your communication with the editor. Most importantly, remember to be respectful and professional during this process. This is your community and your future network. You may end up submitting to the journal again. You may be asked to review articles for the journal. You may want to become a board member one day, or you may have dreams of collaborating with the people that are currently reviewing your paper. So keep all of this in mind during the process. And remember, the editor and the peer reviewers are just trying to help you publish the very best version of your work. Peer review is a gift. It may be a bit painful at times, but it's an absolute gift. Right, so people often ask us, what are the top reasons for rejection? So we've asked our editors over the years to give us their opinion on why articles tend to be rejected. I just thought I would go through this list a little bit. So the number one reason probably won't surprise you because I think I mentioned it earlier in the talk, and that is it was sent to the wrong journal. It doesn't match the aims and scope of the journal. So again, remember to carefully read those aims and scope statements and take a look at what's been previously published in the journal, especially in the last 3 to 5 years. Number two, this comes back to the point I was making at the very beginning of the talk. It's really important that you understand what sort of writing project you're undertaking and research the best platform for your work, because it might not be an academic journal. It could be that you're in the process of writing a book or that it's more public scholarship. Number three is fairly easy to address. This is really about reading the instructions for authors because it'll tell you exactly what the word counts are for the different types of articles that they accept. I tend to group numbers 4 through 9 together because I think the solution or the response to this is quite similar. And this is really about sharing your work as much as possible before you submit the journal for peer review. So you want to have trusted colleagues read and comment on your paper. And I encourage you to find those colleagues that will give you tough critical feedback that's designed to help you improve your work. So you want to find those colleagues that have the red pen, that they'll rip your paper apart, helping you to improve it. it's good to have those colleagues that pat you on the back too and say, great job, but you need to find those people that will really give you that tough feedback. Also consider presenting your work as much as possible outside of your community. So if you can present it at conferences, whether they're regional conferences or international conferences, that's a great way of developing your work. And I think that's becoming easier now because so many conferences have moved online. So the cost isn't quite as demanding. Now, the last issue here, libelous, unethical, rude, or lacks objectivity. Obviously, you want to avoid this at all costs. So before I finish, I'd like to highlight a couple of excellent resources that we have. The first one is our Author Services website, which I mentioned earlier, and it offers support and guidance and tips on copyright and ethics and choosing a journal, and also what you can do to help promote your journal after publication. And this is also where you'll find information about our editing services. Another resource I'd like to highlight is our How Researchers Change the World podcast and learning program. So every episode of the podcast of How Researchers Change the World features a researcher and a piece of research that has shaped the way we think today. So you hear the story behind the research directly from the researcher. They'll tell you why this topic was so important to investigate, how the research was developed, and how it's gone on to impact the world we live in. And then alongside the podcast, we've developed 2 12-week learning programs for researchers. So one's designed for early career researchers and one for mid-career researchers. And these resources are absolutely free. So again, I'll share these slides with you so you'll have the link to the website there. And then lastly, I'd like to mention our new program, which is called the Knowledge Retreat. And this resource is an oasis from the pressures of scholarly publishing. So it's been created for the academic research community and thinking about your brain, basically. The program offers free access to expert advice by researchers on improving your focus and inspiration when writing or when researching. So I encourage you to check this out. And that is it for me. As mentioned, there's my email address. You're welcome to contact me after this session if we don't have the chance to address your question during the session.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for what I thought was a very clear presentation. Lots and lots of very useful information, as of course we see from the very lively chat box. People are really appreciating your advice, Victoria. And as we said, we will share the slides and we will share the recording as well. So you have time to go over this again. Maybe you need a little bit time to look at it closely and to digest the information. But I think with this very useful advice at hand, everybody should be on the fast track to get their research published. We have time for a few questions. I think some of the questions have been answered in the later stages of your presentation, but I want to just point out some of the questions here. A question, a very simple one. Someone is asking what kind of tense should they use? Past tense, past perfect tense, present tense. What is recommended in an article?
Yeah, it really depends on the type of research you're conducting and what that research looks like. It also will vary between disciplines and subject matter. So what I recommend there is looking at some examples of work that is similar to yours in journals that are publishing work. And also just, again, use your network and talk to them about what they use and what they do. I think it's really difficult to say a general, to give a general answer for that. But when I was starting out, I just read as much as I could and basically adopted similar styles to research that was similar to mine.
Thank you, Victoria. There's a question from Dr. B.S. Yule, who is just basically asking, I guess it's the question chicken or egg. What should be the rationale, the thinking process when you're writing? Should you first think about the journal before you start writing? Or should you, as once you know the results, pick the journal? Which should come first? What would be your advice?
Well, I think it's always good to think about who your audience is when you're writing, because it just saves you a lot of time in the end. Obviously, you can write a paper and then go look for a journal that fits it, but it's likely to add a lot of work. It's also great to know what a lot of the formatting requirements are as you're writing, so that you don't have to go back and switch that. But I would recommend thinking about who your audience is, and that would be thinking about what journal you're going to submit to from the start.
Thank you so much. And there's a question from Julie, who's based in Vietnam, who has a question. She submitted a paper to a journal when it was in the Scopus list, but I guess as she did more research, she realized that was not the correct journal for her. She wanted to withdraw her submission, but the journal did not agree. What is your advice for a young scholar in that situation? What are their options?
Well, the journal, I mean, withdrawing a paper from the peer review process is absolutely okay. This comes back to that the point I was making about duplicate submissions. A lot of people ask about this. What happens if the peer review is taking too long? Can I submit to another journal? If you have written evidence that you formally are withdrawing your paper from peer review, that is enough. I'm not sure why that journal didn't accept your request to withdraw the paper. And I don't know what stage of the process. I mean, if the paper was already in production, then I can imagine that that's why they would want to withdraw it. But as long as if it's still in peer review, you can absolutely withdraw your paper. But I recommend that you have some sort of written communication that you can show later on that you formally withdrew the paper.
Thank you, Victoria. Now, there's another question, I think, that affects young scholars. The question is, articles published in conference proceedings, is there an option to publish those in an academic journal? What is your advice?
Yeah, it depends, which I know isn't helpful, but it does depend. So as I mentioned, presenting your work at conferences is a part of the process. It's a very important part of the process. So if the article is included in conference proceedings, it depends on what version of the article. Is it a short abstract that was included in the proceedings? Is it a long abstract? The most important thing is to be very transparent with the editor of the journal that you're submitting to. So if you have a version of your research that has been included in conference proceedings, you need to make an argument of why this new version of your article is adding something new to the literature, adding something new to the research field. And so just be frank with the editors, let them know, show them examples, show them, let them know what the different elements you are adding to it and the contribution you're making with the newer version.
Thank you, Victoria. Now, the audience is particularly grateful for the information that you've provided on how to identify predatory journals and how to deal with this. There's a question here from Nita. Nita is wondering, she's wondering whether you're familiar with the Beals list and whether this is a trustworthy list to reference to when you're making a choice where to publish.
Yeah, I mean, there was some controversy around the Beals list a few years ago. The trick with the Beals list now is I believe it's behind a paywall. But the Beals list would be what we consider a blacklist. And what I would recommend is looking at whitelists, if at all possible, which the DOAJ is. So that's saying that's a list of, they've looked at journals, they've assessed journals to make sure that they are legitimate journals. And all the journals that are included in the DOAJ, they've gone through that kind of assessment process. So you can trust those journals that are there. But I haven't taken a look at the Beals list in recent years, but I think that there is oversight on it now. And I do know that a lot of people do refer to the Beals list, but I can't comment on much more than that.
Thank you, Victoria. Maybe two more questions before we close it. And Victoria has kindly shared her email, so you can contact her as well directly. A question from Champatong, asking what type of referencing system is usually used in international journal formats. I think they were
what type of referencing? Well, and again, it's different with every discipline. So certain disciplines use you know, Chicago style, whereas others use another style. So that's a difficult one to say, just because there isn't any consistency there. But that information will be in the instructions for authors for the journals that you submit. And usually different disciplines do have a standard style of referencing that they use.
Yes, exactly. And as Victoria keeps saying, you really have to familiarize yourselves with the instructions from the specific journal that you're picking, and then stick to their rules and standards and templates. One final question, a very specific one, I think, but I thought we should mention it. There is someone who has written, co-authored a publication, and during the writing of what I assume must have been an experiment, someone else did an experiment in their lab. Now, they did not include them in the author list. Is that acceptable, or should that person have been included?
So were they involved in the research themselves? Did I understand that?
From what I understand, they were involved only indirectly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult without knowing the specifics of that process. But I would say if it was more indirectly, oftentimes people aren't included. I mean, oftentimes it's the people that were directly, but again, this varies so much with different research teams. I mean, there's that example from a few years ago from the CERN Institute, where there were over 3,000 authors on a paper. So, I mean, you have a lot of variation here. But there is oftentimes people that they feel that they were excluded from the authorship line. They should have been included. It's difficult to do something about it after the fact, but if you feel like you should have been included, it's worthwhile to have a conversation, again, a respectful, gentle conversation, perhaps with the people in your lab. Authorship lines can be changed. We're loath to do that after publication, but if there's a good argument and all the authors agree, and the institution agrees, then sometimes authors' names are added. But again, if it's a kind of indirect contribution, it's not unusual that you would be excluded from the authorship line.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for this answer. And thank you so much for this fabulous presentation. And to all of you, thank you so much for attending. Victoria, again, has kindly shared her email address here. So if you have any very specific questions, you may want to reach out to her. But I think you have really here a treasure trove of information on how to navigate this publishing process and to make sure that your research gets out there and gets seen by other researchers in your field, and hopefully that will lead to collaborations. We will have in the next 8 days or so a series of workshops that are building on what we've learned today, namely how to get published. We will have a training tomorrow at 6 o'clock Singapore or KL time on design thinking your research career. So that may be the next step in your career development. So I invite all of you to participate in that as well. And just a few days later, we have a training workshop on how to create an impact for your research, because I've seen in the chat box someone was asking about social media, what role it plays in making sure that your publications get noticed. So join us for this session on the 13th of December to get more information on that. Now, I think it's time for us to close. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Victoria, as always. It was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
We'll look forward to having you again very soon.
Yes. Great. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, and goodbye.